How's everyone doing? Final talk before coffee. Okay. So yeah, it is very humbling, and for me to be on stage is a little bit odd. Because I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not even an AI specialist. But so as a psychologist, I'm just going to be self-indulgent here and kick this off with an existential question. Because when I'm at these conferences, this is kind of what I'm asking myself. Because honestly, before 6 months ago, when I founded Woebot Labs, this was my idea of industry. President business, evil corporations, profit motive, and this was my idea of academics. This is actually the library at Trinity College Dublin, which you can see is built to resemble a cathedral, because it's all purity in the pursuit of knowledge, of course. But the truth is, of course, that it's the intersection of these very different worlds in which great innovation happens, and of course I think that's the magic of where we live in Silicon Valley here. And the truth, of course, is that we're all trying to solve the same problem, and that is that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that mental illness has really reached epidemic proportions at this point. And this has actually become much more urgent recently. This is something that is growing and growing very quickly. So this is statistics from 2013 and shows the amount of money spent in the US. This is just on psychotherapy appointments and pharma treatments. This does not cover hospitalizations or loss of earnings through at work. So this, you can see the spending vastly is higher than what we spend, for example, on heart conditions or cancer, over 200 billion. But actually, this is the more interesting and striking statistic. About 2/3 of people who could use help from a clinician will actually never get in front of one. And nowhere is this more evident than on our college campuses across the US. And what's startling is that no matter what university you go to, the statistics are all the same. About half of the student population endorse having symptoms of depression or anxiety that are so severe they can't function. And we know that these problems are growing not just in prevalence but in severity. And the great work from Daniel Eisenberg, who does a lot of epidemiological work in college campuses, has shown that students are not actually attending the clinical services that we have. And on college campuses, we actually have reasonable access to lower cost peer support and counseling services, but they don't actually present. And when we ask why, of course we know these systems are hard to access, the expertise is unusual, and therapy appointments can actually be expensive. But the number one problem why people don't get in front of a clinician is actually stigma. So at Woebot Labs, our mission was to make the best psychological tools radically accessible to everyone. And we have a very clear definition of what accessibility actually means. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail afterwards. Hey, Woebot. But before I do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of a brief history of modern psychotherapy. Because when I say psychotherapy, I'm sure what you're thinking about is this guy, Freud, who invented psychodynamic psychotherapy around the 1900s. And of course, this was all about, analysis of dreams and lying on couches and just sort of endless talking, stream of consciousness. But actually, Freud did develop a lot of the early sort of structure and architecture of what therapy looks like. Two people in a room, right? Which I would argue we haven't really fully let go of yet. But also, Freud really focused on the subconscious and the unconscious and brought those things into actual being, because people were not thinking about that at the time. The pendulum swung completely in the opposite direction with the behaviorists like Watson, who is giving phobias to infants, and Skinner and his Skinner box and running rats around, and Pavlov's dogs and what have you. And the behaviorists really believed that nothing matters except for outward observable behavior. So just remember that, keep that in your mind for a minute. But because of that, because they essentially denied that, anything that was happening inside of someone's minds, people's thoughts and their unconscious and what have you, they denied that was actually even important. That actually prevented any real development in psychotherapy for several decades. So it wasn't until the 50s that Carl Rogers talked about person-centered psychotherapy, which was really sort of humanistic. And what Carl Rogers proposed was that this idea of unconditional positive regard as being really important for, and actually an essential element for the necessary condition for change. Also around the 50s was Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy. So for the first time we had thinking about emotions, also behaviors, and rational being like thinking about your thoughts in a more objective way. So Albert Ellis is considered the godfather of cognitive behavioral therapy. But really, CBT did not become a household name until Aaron Beck developed it in the 60s and 70s. And how many of you are actually familiar with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy? Okay, great, okay. So I won't go into it in too much detail, but effectively the whole, this is based on the idea that it's not events themselves that disturb us, but how we interpret those events. So it's not the fact that you lost your job, it's the fact that you're telling yourself that you're a complete loser, that you're never going to get another job, that you've let your family down. Those are the things that you're actually reacting to and are very upsetting, not the actual job loss itself. But CBT really synthesized these former perspectives, and it really took psychotherapy out of the realm of like endless talking about, your dreams and your relationship with your mother, and much closer to something that was actually data-driven, time-limited, and importantly, it became evidence-based. It became the most evidence-based approach actually to mental illness. So it still to this day has a huge wealth of evidence that supports that it's effective across different problems and across different populations. Then in 1981, David Burns, who had been working with Aaron Beck, actually published his book called Feeling Good. And so David Burns, what made his book really different was that it, for the first time, took this, what was quite a technical approach to therapy, and he put it in the language of regular people so that they could use it, completely transforming the field of what at the time was called self-help, which of course is terrible branding because it became synonymous with pop psychology. But actually, because CBT lends itself so well to being translated into the person's hands, because this is actually fundamentally a very self-guided kind of treatment. It requires tracking your thoughts and your behaviors and understanding, getting a piece of paper out and writing down what's the troubling event and what are the things that I'm telling myself during this event to then later track it. So you can see that this is like very appealing for, computers, which for the next 2 decades would deliver versions of CBT that ultimately were shown to be as effective as human-delivered CBT, with 2 major caveats. The first is that all the effect sizes were much higher when there was a guide. And the guide is not a therapist. The guide would check in with someone and say, ooh, you've had a really tough week. It sounds like you're really stressed. You should go back and read chapter 11, right? So they're redirecting to content. They're not actually providing the therapy itself. So the guide this is very exciting because guided self-help could be delivered by a lesser qualified individual. Because remember, up until this point, all of the expertise is tied up in, like people who have PhDs and in these systems that are by definition hard to access. The second caveat about internet delivered CBT is that unfortunately they're just not that fun. So people just didn't stay in the treatment long enough. So it's one thing in a randomized clinical trial, you basically pay people to go through the sessions and complete your assessment at the other end so that you can track whether it's been effective or not. But it's quite another to just hope that people find you online and consistently use your product. So along came smartphones in 2007, and this really should have changed everything because suddenly we have access to all of this fantastic computing power in our pockets. And, people were making incredibly engaging things, right? Why can't CBT be like Candy Crush? Well, it turns out it's not really like Candy Crush. what really should have spurred huge treatment development progress, what ultimately happened was an enormous void opened, which got filled by a lot of people creating apps for mental health, which unfortunately had no data to support them. So, such that there's a famous meta-analytic review that was done in, I think it was 2015, actually it was published, but it examined abstracts from 5,500 abstracts covering mental health apps. Of which only 5 had randomized controlled data, which covered, and none of those apps were actually commercially available by the end of the year. So we'll talk about a huge divide between what's happening in academic settings and the real world. So in 2016, last year in June, Woebot was born to really build on this great work and synthesize all of this great work that has come before it, but in a way that's actually both evidence-based and engaging. So we believe that actually Woebot has the potential to be a new paradigm in digital mental health, precisely because actually Woebot is not human. So rather than this being something that degrades the experience somehow, we actually believe that it's a major value proposition because, and we've known this, there's a great study in Southern California where they randomized people to an AI, it was called Ellie, a virtual therapist, when they were told this is just an AI, or AI when they were told that there's a human behind it, which was not the case. And then expert clinicians afterwards, who were blind to the condition in which people were randomized, reviewed the transcripts afterwards and found that people who had been randomized to Ellie when they were told it was just an AI were willing to disclose more and had deeper conversations with the AI. And this makes sense to me because actually, when we think about the notion of stigma, we always say, oh, stigma is like the fear of being judged and people will judge you. But actually, if you really dig into what that means, any interaction you have with another person, you are considering, how am I appearing right now? Do I look like a crazy person on the stage? How are they perceiving what I'm saying? And when you remove that noise from the conversational exchange, you can go into something very personal very quickly. The other piece about the potential for Woebot that we're really excited about is the fact that, and this is because coming from an academic setting where we were developing treatments for a long time, the conventional way that you get to have a much more personalized experience. I mean, to develop treatments, we need to understand for whom what works and under what circumstances. Precision, what we used to call precision psychiatry, right? If this person isn't going to do well with this approach, maybe they do better with that approach. We're seeing more and more of this in pharmacology now as well, but the problem is in conventional treatment development, you need enormous sample sizes to have sufficient statistical power to be able to tease apart those relationships. So when you have something at scale, you actually have, we have those data sets, and we're really looking forward to doing that. The other piece, of course, that's important is that Woebot's integrated into everyday life. And I know we say this, we kind of take it for granted. This is the kind of promise of digital mental health. But if you consider when most people are having a panic attack, it's Sunday evening at 1 a.m. And that's not when you are actually able to get in touch with a clinician, right? So this version of Woebot here is an example of a breathing exercise that he sends someone when someone reaches out to him and says that they are panicking or they're experiencing really intense physiological anxiety. So that's something that's been unprecedented as well. So, we conducted the randomized controlled trial at Stanford, which we said. We randomized 70 young adults between 18 and 28 to receive either 2 weeks of talking to a Woebot or a National Institutes of Mental Health ebook. And we found that after 2 weeks, we were able to significantly reduce symptoms of depression. Both groups reduced significantly their symptoms of anxiety, actually. But what's interesting about this is that this is a very fast response to an intervention. But the major, I think the even bigger finding from the study were things like this. So when we actually talked to people about their experience, what was the best thing that they thought about Woebot and the worst thing, people were using this language that made it clear to us that they're actually developing a relationship. This person, I love Woebot so much, I hope we can be friends forever. I actually feel super good and happy when I see that it remembered to check in with me. And I like how she said remember, because this isn't somebody actually over, thinking that Woebot can do something that he can't. They know that it's just a chatbot, and they consistently said that. I know this is just a chatbot, but it feels like a friend, and it's nice that something checks in with me every day. And so this is something that has not been possible before with apps that address mental health. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about what Woebot's belief system is, and this is really goes to the core of the fundamental kind of how we design, and these beliefs, even though they sound quite they sound a bit just sort of normal and mundane here, are actually crucial for making design decisions. One of those beliefs is that people are fundamentally dynamic, and of course interesting. Woebot's always trying to figure out humans. But Woebot believes that that a really good clinician should facilitate somebody else's process. He shouldn't become part of it. And so that actually lends itself well to a robot. There's an implicit understanding that I'm just a robot, so you're actually going to have to do all the work. I'll ask you the right questions, but it's over to you, effectively. But a Woebot also believes that distorted thinking is part of just the human condition. So it's not about diagnosis, which is why he's agnostic to diagnosis, and it's not about, what's wrong with you, the deficit model. It's about understanding that everybody goes through tough times, everybody's going to lose, a loved one, everybody's going to lose a family member. This is part of what it is to be alive. And we all experience distorted thoughts, especially in context of extreme emotion. So related to that idea is also that Woebot is really committed to having a growth mindset and tries to actually teach that, because we feel that, very inspired of course by Carol Dweck's work at Stanford, that diagnostic labels can actually be somewhat limiting, and people tend to live up to them, whereas actually what they were supposed to be for was a form of communication, a sign that you need to work on something. Finally, Woebot really believes that people don't have to change. So this is where he practices sitting with open hands, and we were talking earlier about this. This is why Woebot will never employ persuasion. Woebot's never going to try and have people addicted to Woebot. That ultimately it's up to people whether or not they want to change. And Woebot's completely fine with your decision either way. He also believes that CBT can be useful for everybody, but it's not always sufficient. Obviously Woebot is not trying to replace therapy. He's actually trying to be something completely different. But that, the responsibility should be with the person to get, extra help if needed. And also just things that we've known from the online learning literature, that learning in the context of someone's life is actually more impactful than learning that's tied to a specific place and time. And also obviously Woebot is committed to being funny, even though his sense of humor is pretty dorky. But he believes that humor is actually, that being human is actually, we're pretty ridiculous as well. And this is actually about being kind of, again, moving away from the deficit model, making something that's very accessible, and humor is part of that. And finally, of course, Woebot also believes in self-care. So I'll just leave it there if you have any questions.